Welcome to my presentation about Joseph and prison, using Genesis 37:1 to Genesis 41:40. Now, there are many stories about Joseph, the son of Jacob, in the Bible. And this is not the Joseph and Mary story. That's a much later story. This one is in Genesis. And Joseph is very famous for his coat of many colors. He might be also noted for his presumed arrogance, for telling of his dream that his family would bow down to him. But that's also another story. So this story is about focusing on the time he went to prison for rape. Now, we often don't think about this as a family story about Joseph in prison, but it's what actually is in Genesis. Now, this story spans two parsha in reading in the Tanakh, but for my sharing, I've extended it to include the elements that are important to the message that I would like to talk about. So when we talk about this, again, we're looking at Joseph, who is considered a Bible hero, a Bible champion, and what a success story, right? Slavery to success. He's good looking, he's beautiful inside and out, he's pure, even unblemished, almost perfect, right? So from ages 17 to 30, he was actually in prison. His brothers sold him into slavery, um, but he was so accomplished already that he knew how to run a household at the age of 17. And his new master made him the steward of his household. Now, of course, he was also incredibly good looking and righteous. Now, what happened next is the steward, or his new master's wife, took quite a liking to him, and she accused him of raping her. And so, because he was so good looking, right? So his master immediately imprisoned him. Didn't seem to even ask what happened, but he was imprisoned, unjustly accused and convicted by one man, or should I say, one woman's report. Now, there's lots of little stories in here, but I'm going to just stick to this theme. So basically, he's living his best life. Everything his master has, he has, save his wife. So he was of marriageable age at that time, but no wife is mentioned in these first chapters, not even a concubine. So he has no sexual history to report, which is, of course, also very interesting because for those of you who are aware of uh, Jewish traditions, at the age of 13, you become an adult if you're a man, and then you're promptly married. And when we start talking about Benjamin later, his younger brother comes to Egypt and he already has like seven kids, seven sons even. And he's not very old. But anyway, so again, we know that this woman uh, was scorned by Joseph. Joseph refused to have sex with her, and so um, she accused him of raping her anyway. And so we've all heard that saying that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And really, she does the worst thing that she can do to him, and so he is imprisoned for almost more than half of his life until he was 30. So again, this is a story that isn't about her or rape in that particular way, but it's about Joseph's faith and his success as a result of that faith. So we all know the story that he was in prison for these um, 14 years. I do my math right there, 13 years. And then at the age of 30, he was released because he interpreted two dreams for the Pharaoh king. Um, and he interpreted first dreams for the baker and the butler. And then after that, 2 more years he spent in prison. Then he was finally released. He was given a new name, an Egyptian name, and he was then made the prime minister. So again, quite the meteoric rise from a slave and in prison to now the prime minister of Egypt, all of Egypt. So when we think about Joseph and his adverse childhood experiences, because that's exactly what he had, although these were much more common in those days. He was the youngest of 12 that we know of, because there are a number of children that Jacob has that are not really mentioned, like most of his daughters, with the exception of Dinah. He was the apple of his father's eye. And we are, most of us, familiar with the story of Jacob, who had two wives and two handmaids. So, um, Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. And he was pretty much hated by his brothers because Jacob really doted on him and gave him more and treated him better. So at the age of 17, he's sold into slavery by his brothers. Now, what happens after the selling and receiving of Joseph as property? Well, he's seen as someone who is blessed, actually. So the idea was that you could see it if God was with you. And the Lord blessed everything that Joseph handled for his master, for Joseph's sake, not for his master's sake. Now, pay attention to that line. He paid no attention to anything except what he ate. So when we look at the scripture, we see that his boss, his master, didn't think about anything else in the running of his business or his household or anything. He just gave that all to Joseph, and all he cared about was his next meal. Now, the next thing that happens, of course, is this false accusation, a woman scorned. And the next thing he knows, the sweet life is gone. And this adverse experience has happened to him. Suddenly he's gone from being the top of the food chain, if you will, to being not only enslaved, but imprisoned. So for most of us, I would imagine that you would think that what happened to God? Like God was with him, everything was blessed, everything's going great for him. And then all of a sudden, boom, like the rug is ripped right out from underneath him. His faith is suddenly what? Could we maintain our own faith if this kind of thing happened to us? And I know there are a number of people who have experienced something very similar to this, falsely accused and imprisoned for many, many years of your life. So what happens? Did God abandon Joseph? Well, no, he blessed him in prison as well. If we look at verse 20, it says that God gave Joseph the top job while he was even in prison. And again, whatever Joseph did, the Lord made successful. Now, sometime later was not defined here in the scripture, but we can imagine that it is a few years because the baker and the butler are then imprisoned. Of course, they have their own dreams. Joseph interprets those dreams. And then, even though Joseph is correct, the baker or the butler forgets that he did this thing. So, yes, it's okay to interpret your dreams and to ask for someone to do that for you. Now, this interpretation includes uh, this idea that Pharaoh needed to find a man of discernment and wisdom and to set him over the land of Egypt, because that's what the Pharaoh's dream was about. And so Joseph told him that he needed to find a man of discernment and wisdom. And that he had a plan already just after hearing the dream. So this is what Joseph does. He says, well, here's what the dream means, and here's what you need to do. So he's telling him, this is what God's telling you, and this is what's going to happen, and here's how you can solve your new problem. Now, Joseph says, it's not me that's interpreting your dream, it's God. So God is there, divine inspiration, the dream is interpreted, and the Pharaoh recognizes the value and the worth of Joseph, and he is elevated to everything short of the throne. So what Pharaoh says is, since God has made all this known to you, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my court, and by your command shall all my people be directed. So again, this is when pharaohs at that time, contextually, pharaohs were considered deities in their own rights. They were anointed and they were demigods or they were gods. They couldn't be totally gods because they died. And so Joseph, with a quick turnaround, and really they talk about they give him clean clothes and they cut his hair, and then suddenly he's handed the world, the keys to the kingdom, if you will. So why are we talking about this? Well, faith in times of doubt, fear, misfortune is really the message of Joseph's time in prison. So the Lord was with him. He was successful. He was 30 when he was released from prison, almost half of his life spent in prison. Not really the best environment for anyone. And, you know, the prisons during Pharaoh's time didn't have food or water or air conditioning, but he did have everything going for him once he recovered from the setback about being sold into slavery, anyway. And he is so attractive that it cost him his freedom. So Joseph is the ultimate man, right? He's pure, he's honest, he's faithful, he believes in God, God is blessing him, he's amazingly handsome. So how can you help this if this is the way you're born, right? But that's a different lesson. So he goes to prison. Now, some might think that God let this bad thing happen to this pure, innocent child, right? But that isn't how Joseph took it. We don't have a record of his day to day or his year to year in prison, but his faith in God was such that he was still blessed and prospered by God. And we know that Abraham complained when he thought God was being unjust and Lot was saved. You might say out of the frying pan into the fire about Lot, but that's a whole different conversation. Now, again, during Joseph's time in prison, he makes it to the top job again without any supervision. The chief jailer places Joseph in charge of the king's prison. I would imagine that he made things better for everyone there. And because it says that God was with him and made him successful. You might wonder what blessing a prison looks like, but we'll take a positive thought for that. He does ask for help, and he is forgotten for 2 years, right? He asks the butler to tell the Pharaoh that he is here. So that is a big delay when you're expecting to be freed from this bad thing that's happened to you, this misfortune, and you're expecting to be freed because you've done this good thing. Now, in the next scene in Joseph's life, he is brought out of prison and finds favor with the Pharaoh king, and then he is the prime minister in charge of all the lands and people. So, in the twinkling of an eye, suddenly Joseph has a new name, new clothes, new job, and a new life. He's given a wife, and he has 2 sons, and the blessings continue to follow him. His belief in God sustains him in these times. Now, there will always be obstacles in your way, misfortune that is not removed. Misfortune is not removed from a believer's path, right? We know that just because you believe or you have faith doesn't mean that suddenly you're free from any difficulties or problems. Quite the contrary. It's almost like the joy of exercising your faith is the whole point. And as anyone who works out knows, you have to stretch and exercise your goals to find increases in strength and fitness. Joseph got fired and imprisoned. That was the second lowest he could go. The first, of course, was his family selling him into slavery. From the lowest rung in society to the highest. It's a suggestion that the lower you find yourself, the higher you boomerang up. Just like a rubber band, the farther you're stretched, the farther you'll go. You can imagine the Netflix dramatization of this whole part of Joseph's life, the suspense, right? So when you feel that God has abandoned you, don't believe it. That is a false God muscling in on your faith. You can reject those ideas or thoughts before they become rooted in your mind. Chase them out with Jehovah Jireh, God is my supply. Now, ultimately, Joseph's explanation for why he was sold into slavery was for the greater good of his family and of all the lands around him. But that is also another story that you can keep reading on from here. Because God is always on your side, never leaves you or abandons you, always has your success in mind, then the doubt and fear can be banished. You can think about Joseph waiting half of his life before he was vaulted to greatness and for saving all of the people, the purpose of his life in some ways. He did live a very long time after that, and he was very successful and very wealthy. So when you can talk about your faith in times of doubt, fear, or misfortune, that is really the message of Joseph's time in prison. Thank you for joining me today. Hope you enjoyed this presentation. Click subscribe, and we'll hope to see you next time.